Okay, I'm gonna have to do this in 2 segments since it's longer, and yeah, I'm gonna get it done though, so that I make sure I have it posted for you guys tomorrow. So we were in the middle of chapter 29, I do believe. Yep. While ravens and apes were busy battling in the halls, the children found themselves awash in the palace sewer system. The exhausted, newly freed slaves tumbled up through channels and shafts, finally spilling out of the gargoyles' open mouths. They landed in a huge pile in the middle of the eating hall, dazed and drenched. Peg and Sir Toad were among the last to emerge. They slid down the sputtering mound of children and then splashed to the floor. Peter's burgle sack came bouncing after them and knocked the princess in the back of her head. As she stumbled to her feet, rubbing her head and draining her ears, she heard shouts from the hallway. "Citizens, follow me!" It was the king, and he was not alone. Peg turned and began calling to the children. "Everyone listen! There's something I must tell you about the grown-ups. The king has drugged..." Her words were drowned out as hundreds of adults stampeded into the eating hall, spears high in the air. Incarnadine led the charge, his spurs clanking against the wet floor. "Kill the monsters!" he shouted, racing toward his niece. Anybody that's calling kids monsters and saying to kill them, they are the monster, right? "Kill the monsters!" the adults echoed, racing toward their children. The children struggled to extricate themselves from the pile before the grown-ups could trample them. Lillian pulled Timothy and a few others close, trying to shield them from the onslaught of crazed parents. "Ignore their cries," the king said over the din. "Kill them all." He continued toward Peg, shoving aside anyone in his way. The princess tried to run in the opposite direction, but her uncle was too fast. "Get back here, brat!" He seized her by the arm. The girl twisted against his iron grip, grabbing hold of the burgle sack with her freed hand. "Sir Toad!" she cried. "Get the eyes to see!" She lobbed the bag over her head. It soared in a high arc and landed with a splash at his hooves. "Grab that bag!" the king ordered. He had no idea what it was, but judging from the princess's desperation, it probably contained a secret weapon. A dozen adults obediently lunged for it, very nearly crushing Sir Toad beneath their shields. The king wiggled free with the fishhook in his teeth. "On guard!" he cried, and swiped with all his might. Adults around him howled and collapsed, clutching their nicked shins. Because he was so short, he only got their chins. Sir Toad looped the burgle sack around his neck. "I shall return, your majesty!" He galloped past his attackers and disappeared down the main corridor. When Sir Toad promised the princess that he would return, it was with some vague idea that he might be able to find reinforcements. As soon as he reached the outer palace, however, he realized how impossible that would be. In the minutes since he had parted ways with the ravens, their predicament had turned dire. It seemed that no matter where the birds flew, there was a javelin or mace waiting to meet them. Unlike the thieves, the apes did not waste time with clipping. Instead, they gorged themselves, ripping the ravens to pieces with their greedy mouths. Though Simon and his troops fought bravely, they were no match for the vicious night patrol. Sir Toad raced through the carnage in search of Peter, but he was nowhere to be found. In fact, he couldn't recall having seen the boy since parting ways the night before. He assumed Peg knew her brother's whereabouts. She had shouted something to him about getting the eyes to see. But what on earth did that mean? And he said to see S-E-E, but she had said to see S-E-A. Okay? His thoughts were interrupted by a hungry snarl. "Dibs on the cat!" Sir Toad clambered backward as an ape broke from the pack and chased after him. "Here, kitty, kitty," it said, already drooling at the prospect of night tartare. A dozen ravens seized the opportunity and swooped down on the beast, pecking and scratching as its exposed hump with terrific fury. The ape crashed to the ground with such force that Sir Toad flew backward, tripping over himself and spilling the contents of the burgle sack everywhere. "Sir Toad!" a voice squawked. "You are not safe here!" The knight looked up to see Simon, bloody but very much alive. "We cannot fight like this much longer. Where is Her Majesty's army?" "I'm afraid they're, busy," Sir Toad said, remembering the terrified screams of the slave children as they ran from their crazed parents. "It would appear that both sets of reinforcements are in need of reinforcements." He jumped to his hooves and set to collecting Peter's things, which were scattered across the floor. Arrows whizzed past them all on all sides. "Down the hall! That one's the leader!" Longclaw said, pointing toward Simon. We kill him and the others will fall like finches. A half-dozen apes followed his charge. Sir Toad ignored the burgle tools and went straight for the box of fantastic eyes. He snapped the lid shut tight and stuffed it into the bag. My brothers and I shall keep the apes occupied as long as possible, Simon called, lifting Sir Toad off the ground. You must protect the line. With that, he flung the knight through an open window into the chasm below. Just threw him out the window. That's kind of funny. Sir Toad, who had not expected to be flung anywhere, clenched his eyes shut and screamed with the full force of his lungs as he sailed toward the bottomless crag. But instead of hitting rock, his body plunged into foamy water. He bobbed to the surface a moment later, coughing and kicking. Before he could even cry for help, a great lazy wave shoved him toward the castle and deposited him on the stone shore. Sir Toad wobbled to his hooves and looked at the sea before him. The just deserts, which had stretched from horizon to horizon, were now completely washed away. The palace behind him was all that remained of the vanished kingdom. Not so vanished any more, he said, shaking himself dry. As if in reply, a hideous sea serpent broke from the waves and loosed a chilling shriek. The poor knight nearly died from the fright. He leapt back and pressed himself against the wall. Don't eat me. The serpent remained still, glaring straight at him. It shrieked again, but this time in a slightly less murderous tone. Sir Toad stared into the monster's shiny black eyes, which somehow looked familiar to him. All at once he understood what the princess had been trying to tell him. Get the eyes to see. S-E-A. Peter? He said, inching closer. Is it really you? The animal shrieked back at him, gnashing his glassy teeth. Bloody Gale, mate! Frederick appeared from below. How many times you gonna make him ask? He needs you to pluck his peepers out so he can change back into a little boy. Though I can't see why he'd want to, fragile as flounders those humans are. Sir Toad swallowed and took another timid step toward the serpent. All right, he said weakly, let's get it over with. It was a bit of a chore removing a pair of eyes with just hooves, but after some difficulty, Sir Toad was able to manage. The next thing he knew, his friend Peter Nimble was splashing in the water below him. My goodness, he exclaimed, it's really you. More or less, Peter said, shivering. He was a bit disoriented, having been an enormous sea serpent only seconds before. He pulled himself ashore and flopped onto his back, taking a moment to remember how all his little boy senses worked. Is it over? Did we defeat the king? I'm afraid not. Sir Toad cast a glance toward the palace. The apes have nearly extinguished Simon's troops, and the children are being attacked by their own parents. Peter listened to the screams ringing out from the eating hall. He knew the effects of the previous day's devil's drum would wear off soon, but from the sound of things, soon was not fast enough. We have to stop the grown-ups before they hurt the children, he exclaimed. We have to make them see. I completely agree. Sir Toad took the burgle sack, which had washed to shore beside him, and he brought it to the boy's feet. I think it's time, Peter. The emerald eyes. Everything within Peter confirmed that the moment had finally come. At last he would try the third pair of fantastic eyes. His heart raced at the thought of what marvelous power they might yield. He knelt down and removed the wooden box from the bag. He took a breath, raised the lid, and reached inside. But something was wrong. No time for cold feet, Sir Toad said. Let's see them in action. Peter's face had gone completely pale. The eyes. They're gone. And that is the end of chapter 29. And since it is almost time for the Zoom, I'm going to stop right there. But I'll be back and I will continue reading. Because we're going to finish this up today, boys and girls. Yes, we are. So that you guys can listen to it on a Friday. All right, I'll be back. All right, let's see how much further we can get. Chapter 30. The Backstabber's Blight. Wasn't that a curse that, almost said Harry, like Harry Potter, Peter talked about earlier? Feel like I remember him telling Sir Toad about it. Or maybe it was just the narrator. At first, Sir Toad refused to believe it. But when he looked for himself, he found only an empty place in the box where the emerald eyes had been. Good heavens, he said, recalling his skirmish with the ape in the corridor. This is all my fault. I dropped the box. They must have fallen out. His voice quavered. Peter, I'm so sorry. Despite his uncanny ears, the boys could not hear his friend, nor could he hear Frederick bobbing in the water beside him, or the clash of battle, or the children screaming. Peter could hear nothing but the hollow sough of his own despair. He had sailed over seas, trekked across sands, survived thieves, apes, and even dragons. All with the confidence that when the moment was right, the fantastic guys would be just what he needed. Sough is pronounced, it said, Peter could hear nothing but the hollow sough, S-O-U-G-H. This author uses some interesting words, doesn't he? S-O-U-G-H. Somebody needs to tell us what that means. He had even let himself half believe that his final pair was proof that he was some kind of prince. But no more. Without the emerald eyes, Peter was forced to acknowledge the truth. They were doomed. Incarnadine would execute the children, rebuild his feet, and sail out to conquer the world. And it was all Peter's fault. His cheeks grew hot when he considered how it was he who had led Peg and the others into this war, a war they couldn't win. The eyes are gone, along with any hope we had of victory, he said. We have to surrender. Up to this point, Sir Toad had been sympathetic, but no more. Surrender? He planted himself in Peter's path. Surrender? We shall do no such thing. We made a promise to the professor, to Peg, to Simon, to ourselves that we would see this quest through. Our friends are depending on us. You may never have to peer into a looking glass, Peter, but I will. And I don't want to see a coward staring back at me. I'm fighting, and if that means death, so be it. I'd rather die a martyr than live a milksop. You can look that word up too, milksop, M-I-L-K-S-O-P. The knight spoke with such passion that Peter had no opportunity to interrupt. Instead, he was forced to listen. With every word, he felt more ashamed. Here was his best friend, unable to even hold a weapon, declaring that he was ready to fight to the death. In the silence that followed, Peter again heard voices behind the palace walls, but this time he truly listened. He heard Simon and Titus squawking, "Long live the line!" He heard Scrape and Lillian shouting, "Protect Her Majesty!" And above them all, he heard Peg telling the children to not be scared because Prince No-Name is coming. Peter knew that to give up was to turn his back on destiny, his destiny. Fantastic eyes or not, he was committed. The boy reached inside his bag and wrapped his fingers around the cold metal of his fishhook. He removed the weapon, feeling its perfect weight in his hand. Frederick sloshed closer to shore. "Not to pry, mate," he gave a nervous chuckle. "But you ain't planning to fish with that, are ya?" "No." He turned toward the palace, his face grave. "I'm planning to fight." Peter and Sir Toad ran as fast as they could. Streams of blood and seawater soaked the floor. Ravens and apes were squawking and snarling all around them. The battle was so loud and confusing that it was all Peter could do not to trip over himself. Even through the chaos, he could tell that his friend's report had been accurate. The ravens were losing. They reached the apex of an open bridge from which Sir Toad could study the movements below. "The apes are at the mouth of a broad corridor that connects to the long courtyard," he relayed to Peter. "If they reach the far end, it's over." "Then we'd better cut them off," Peter said. He ran through every possible barricade he could think of, but treacle and bear traps were in short supply. Shorter still was their supply of time. He could feel the morning sun prickling against his neck and knew that the breakfast bell would soon go off, as if to welcome the approaching horde. It was in thinking of the bell that Peter recalled his first night in the palace. After the chime struck, all the doors had automatically locked. "We don't need to build a barrier," he said suddenly. "The king's got one ready, made, just for us." This time it was Peter who led the way through the battlefield. He kept his body crouched low, running his long fingers along the wall. He was looking for the secret passage that Peg's friends had used when they kidnapped him. If he could just get through in time, there might be a chance. The boy soon found a space in the mortar. "This is the spot," he said, pulling back a stone. He helped Sir Toad into the passage and wiggled in after him. Within the walls, the cries of battle lessened to a low roar. The space was too narrow for Peter to carry Sir Toad, and the knight was forced to follow, blindly tripping over sharp metal cogs with nearly every step. "On my first night here, the boy explained. I came across a gate that blocked off the eating hall from the rest of the palace. I think we might be able to use it to stop the apes. He decided not to mention that if they were still inside the walls when the breakfast bell rang, they would both be crushed flat by the gears. Peter soon found the iron gate, which hung suspended from motionless clockwork. He could hear the battle sounds echoing through a broad slot at his feet. In one direction, apes were hunting ravens. In the other direction, grown-ups were hunting children. Sounds like we're just in time, he said, taking hold of Sir Toad and dropping through the gap. The two of them landed in the middle of the corridor just ahead of the approaching apes. Peter ran to the wall and began searching with his hands. I see a switch to your left, Sir Toad said. The boy took hold of the lever and pulled with all his strength. There came a heavy wrenching sound, and the gate clunk, clunk, clanked down from the ceiling. The long lockpick's cutting us off from the chillers, Longclaw said, tossing a dead raven aside. Stop him! He and his grunts charged ahead, hurling whatever weapons they had. Peter and Sir Toad ducked at spears, shields, pikes, and helmets clattered against the descending gate. The assault crescendoed with an ugly screeching sound. The gate had stopped moving. Oh, drat, Sir Toad said. There's a poleaxe wedged in the track along the wall. He looked up to see the apes racing for them at full bore. Never fear, I think I can work it loose. Before Peter could object, Sir Toad ran to the other side and took the handle in his teeth. He pulled the axe free, and the gate crashed down between them. Sir Toad! Peter pulled against the iron barrier. Go, Your Majesty, he called from the other side. So he dislodged the axe that was keeping the gate from going down, but when he dislodged it, it meant that he was on the side with the apes, and the gate came down, and Peter was on the other side, safe. The knight arched his back and faced the approaching horde. I'll fight with the ravens. Peter nodded, and without another word, the two friends parted, each diving headlong in the battle. The situation in the eating hall was looking truly hopeless. The adults had gotten the hang of their spears and could now poke and jab like a proper mob. Children ran frantic circles around their parents, trying to wear them out without getting skewered. Scrape had wrestled a weapon from one of the weapons and rushed to get Peg away from the king. He and a few others formed a tight circle around her, keeping as much distance as possible between Peg and her uncle. King Incarnadine stalked them through the chaos. He wielded not one but two swords, which he used to hack down anyone in his path. His face bore a delighted grin. He had dreamed of this moment for 10 years and wanted to savor every minute. The breakfast bell began to ring high above them, momentarily drowning out the battle. With each stroke, the water covering the ground trembled. By the time the bell finally stopped, Incarnadine had them cornered. He smirked down at Peg. Time's up, Your Majesty. You stay away from her, Scrape warned, sounding braver than he felt. Marbles and Timothy stood with him, each clutching their own spear. Or what? You'll stick me? The king walked forward, letting the points knock uselessly against his armor. A sweep of his arm sent all three children sprawling. Peg crouched in the water, defenseless and alone. Looks like you're all out of heroes, he said with mock sympathy. The princess tried to flee, but her uncle was ready. Enough running! He gave her a sharp cut across the Achilles tendon that hobbled her instantly. The Achilles tendon is that part of your behind your ankle, at your heel going up, and if you cut it, you can't walk, and it is really painful. So she's got to be hurting. Peg collapsed, screaming as her wound filled with salty water. Stop bawling. If I'd known you'd grow up to be such a nuisance, I would have murdered you in your crib. He took hold of her collar and raised her above the crowd. Attention, citizens, he called. The adults all immediately ceased their spear play. Do not kill the monsters just yet. I want them to witness something first. This is what comes of all who defy your great ruler. Hooray for our great ruler! The people shouted back. Incarnadine carried a flailing Peg to a low stone step in back of the hall. He forced the girl to her knees and placed her head against the step. The princess winced as the rough surface scraped her cheek. She desperately scanned the faces of her shivering subjects. What a fool she had been to think that these children could topple a kingdom. Soon they'd be dead, and it was all her fault. You've won, she said, her throat stinging at the words. Now kill me. If you insist. The man carefully positioned his blade above her throat. Hold still if you know what's good for you. As they say, measure twice. Cut one. Let her go, imposter! A hush fell over the crowd as every adult turned to see who would dare insult their king. Standing in the corridor was a dirty boy of 10, clutching a long silver fishhook. The vision sent a chill through the king's armored body. He could see that it was a lockpick who had stolen his maps, but something about the boy had changed. He now looked less like some filthy urchin and more like Incarnadine's own brother, whom the king had murdered in this very hall. What trick is this? He breathed. My name is Peter Nimble, the boy replied. He walked steadily through the mob, keeping his every sense trained on the king, true heir to the throne of Hazelport. 10 years ago, you murdered my father and stole his crown. I have come back to take it. The king knew at once Peter was speaking the truth. He looked to his subjects who were watching the boy with uncertainty. I command you not to listen to him, he blurted. His voice will turn the whole lot of you into stone. The grown-ups jammed fingers into each ear so as not to hear. A few among them also closed their eyes on the off chance that looking at a stranger might prove similarly dangerous. The children, however, defied the command. A murmur filled the eating hall as Peter walked past. It's really him. It's Prince No-Name. Lies! Incarnadine bellowed, unconsciously gripping the diadem upon his head. That's like his king thing. He's a saboteur sent to destroy my kingdom. He had spent 10 long years brainwashing these people and wasn't about to let some prodigal brat ruin it for him. He dug his spurred heel into Peg's cheek, causing her to scream, Silence those children this instant, or I'll cut the girl's head off. They can't be silenced, Peter said calmly. He raised his fishhook, pointing it straight at the king. If you release her, you can fight me for your precious throne. Incarnadine sneered at the quaint proposition. Oh, risking your life for your sister. How very noble of you. He lifted Peg from the step and hurled her into the crowd. Hold her fast, he ordered. The 2 nearest adults who set to wrestling her down. After I finish the boy, I'll come back for her. The thief and the king slowly approached each other. Though Peter could not see it, he bore a striking resemblance to the man before him. They both had the same dark hair, the same sharp jaw, and the same lean frame, though Incarnadine's was hidden beneath 100 pounds of polished steel. Peter listened to the sound of the clockwork whirring. Beneath the gleaming plate metal, springs tightening, pistons churning, gears grinding. Who knew what terrible powers that suit possessed? The two were now pacing around each other in a slow circle. Come along, nephew, Incarnadine taunted, daring the boy to strike first. Don't be shy. Peter was more than shy. He was terrified. But to look at him, you would never have thought so. Sir Toad's lessons had at least taught the boy proper form, and the king's clockwork suit afforded him the luxury of hearing his opponent's slightest movement. He matched his uncle's every step like a shadow, ever mindful of the blades on each forearm. At last, Peter heard an opening. He lunged forward, sweeping his hook through the air. The king was caught off guard, but not for long. He raised his armored palms just in time to grab the hook. He flexed his fists around the metal, bending it like taffy. You're not much of a swordsman, boy. He ripped the weapon from Peter's hand and flung it to the ground. That's all right. Neither was your father. Now Incarnadine struck back. He swung his swords in constant succession, one high, one low. Peter could barely jump to avoid losing his feet before the second blade came for his head. The boy somersaulted backwards across the hall, dodging swipe after swipe. With each attack, the grown-ups cheered louder for their heroic leader. Some even unplugged their ears to applaud. Peter rolled between his uncle's legs and sprinted back across the hall to retrieve his fishhook. Incarnadine was right behind him, sword still swinging. Silver clashed against stone as the man pursued his prey. Peter tried to block the assault with his crumpled fishhook, but the weapon was useless. So long as the king wore his armor, it would be impossible to kill him. Some warrior you are, Peter mocked his opponent. Only a coward will hide behind plate mail to fight someone half his size. The king, who did not like being maligned in front of his subjects, stopped to consider this. "Very well," he said, taking a step back. "Off it comes." His subject cheered at this show of valor. He unhinged a clasp around his neck, and the breastplate fell to the ground with a hollow clank. The ticking of clockwork grew louder, and Peter could now pick out individual cogs, pistons, and springs as they moved along Incarnadine's newly exposed torso. "But I should warn you, boy, the armor wasn't for my protection. It was for yours." He pushed a small lever at his side, and the entire suit came to life. 100 knives, spurs, and barbs sprang out from the clockwork, all spinning and slicing in a frenzied blur. Peter listened to the dancing blades, barely able to conceive of what was before him. "I assure you, it's something to behold," the man said, reading his nephew's expression. "I fashioned it myself, every inch deadly." He flexed his gauntlet, admiring the blades whirring and slicing all along his arm. Peter had been a fool to think he could taunt this murderer into a fair fight. He scrambled under the eating table to put some distance between himself and the king's armor. Incarnadine followed after him, walking straight into the table. The moment his suit touched the wood, the gears grabbed hold, chewing and slicing and crushing it into a million splinters. Adults and children shielded themselves as wooden shrapnel exploded in all directions. Peter ignored the sounds and kept running until he came against the clock tower wall. He rattled the maintenance door, but found it had been sealed shut with some kind of mortar. His only other option was a staircase jutting out from the facade. He had no idea where it might lead, but at least it would buy him some time. He clambered up the stone steps, zigzagging higher and higher above the hall. The king watched him, somewhat amused. "A dead end," he called. "Too perfect." Peter discovered too late what his uncle meant. The stairs ended at a platform 50 feet above the courtyard. He searched in vain for a hatch or ladder, but could find nothing that would help him escape. Now that Peter was so thoroughly trapped, Incarnadine took his time moving up the steps. He gloated as he climbed. "Before me no man in this kingdom had ever guessed at the clockwork wonders that lie beyond our seas. I alone sailed out to learn these dark magics, only to discover that they were not magic at all. They were figments, little nothings, a mere string of letters and numerals, and unlike magic, this science could be mastered and harnessed." He let his arm graze the wall. Sparks shot out at the spinning blades whetted against the stone. People below cheered this dazzling display. "Listen to them," he said to Peter. "They're powerless in the face of such tricks. I have transformed unthinking beasts into servants and servants into unthinking beasts." His voice was thick with disdain. Peter remained still, listening not to the man's words, but to the sound of his approaching blades. Incarnadine stepped closer, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. "But even better, my dear nephew, was how this magic helped me fly back to the palace, slip undetected into this hall, and cut the still beating heart from my brother's noble chest." "Monster!" Peter hurled the fish hook like a lance. The point grazed Incarnadine's face, and the man staggered backward, nearly losing his balance. There was a murmur of horror when citizens saw blood flowing from the great ruler's cheek. Peter listened as his weapon clattered down the steps and splashed onto the ground below. So much for destiny. Incarnadine erupted into rage. "You little worm!" He charged up the remaining steps. "Thought you'd avenge your precious parents? Thought you could steal the throne from me?" He swiped his arm, catching Peter's shoulder with a dozen tiny blades. The boy collapsed, crippled with pain. "Stand up!" Incarnadine snatched him by the neck and lifted him clear off the ledge. Peter's feet kicked wildly in the air. "You were never a prince." The king tightened his grip. "You're nothing but a pathetic, wretched thief." As Peter fought to breathe, that one word rang in his head. Thief. The insult echoed louder and louder until it was all he could hear. Thief. It was true. Even if he had, by some miracle, won the fight, what did he know about ruling? He was a criminal. He was the imposter. But then the boy recalled another steadier voice, the professor giving his final benediction. "Remember your nature above all things. All through the journey, Peter had assumed he had meant that somewhere inside him lived a noble warrior. Maybe he was saying the opposite. That Peter wasn't a warrior, but a dirty, sneaky thief. The greatest thief who ever lived. And why couldn't a thief be a hero? He suddenly understood how all the trials of his life, abandonment, Mr. Seamus, the just deserts, had prepared him for this moment. He gasped for breath, and his heart swelled with a new desire to fight. This time, he would fight the way he knew best. He started with the rascal's questions. Where was he? Dangling 50 feet above ground, choking to death. Were there friends nearby? He could hear his sister struggling by the stairs, but she was too far away to help. Were there weapons nearby? His fishhook was lying useless on the ground below, leaving him only his hands. But his were no ordinary hands. Peter knew that the king's mechanical suit was no different from any of the locks he had spent his life mastering. All he had to do was find a way in. He focused his every sense on the tick-tock of clockwork before him. He could hear every gear and piston running together toward a narrow gap just below the king's heart. That was his keyhole. This realization, of course, happened in an instant. From Incarnadine's perspective, there was no difference between the boy he had raised above the platform and the boy he was staring at now. No difference but the faintest trace of a smile. "Farewell, dear nephew," the king said as he drew back his sword. "So say hello to my brother for—" Peter plunged his hand straight into the armor. He screamed as clockwork chewed through skin and fingernail and bone, and the pain of 1,000 hot pokers ripped through him. He slipped from the king's grip and collapsed at the edge of the platform. With all of Peter's screaming, it took Incarnadine a moment to realize that he hadn't succeeded in running his nephew through. In fact, his arm was still raised over his head, just as it had been. The gears had stopped whirring, and within seconds, every joint of his terrible armor was locked in place, rendering him completely immobile. "What manner of curse is this?" He strained against the frozen suit. "What have you done to me?" Peter was hunched at his feet, overcome with pain, but still alive. "What I was born to do," he said with a triumphant gasp. He raised his trembling, bloody hand to reveal a tiny brass pin, no bigger than a bodkin. "Impossible!" The king jerked his head about. "You're just a child." "There's no such thing as just a child," a voice spoke from behind. The king craned his neck and saw Peg limping up the steps. She placed a hand on his body and gave a mighty shove. Incarnadine tumbled off the ledge and crashed onto the ground below, piercing his throat on the silver fishhook. There he lay, broken and bleeding, unable to wiggle free from the armor he had constructed. With a final gurgle, he went limp. And thus King Incarnadine died just as the backstabber's blight had predicted, like a miserable worm. A silence came over the eating hall. The adults were terrified beyond words. Never in their wildest imaginings did they think that their mighty ruler could be killed. "Those monsters murdered our king!" one woman cried, covering her mouth. Panic swelled through the crowd as people started for the exits. Peg helped her brother to his feet and stood beside him. She took a deep breath and shouted with all of her might, "Order, subjects!" For once, Peg's words got through. Every man, woman, and child instantly stopped what they were doing and stared up at her. The princess composed herself and went on. "The man you worshipped as king was an impostor. 10 years ago, he seized this land from its true ruler, King Hazelgood." She took Peter's hand and her own. "Today, we, his heirs, have returned to avenge his death and claim what is rightfully ours." The adults' faces were flushed with confusion. Peter squeezed his sister's hand, urging her to go on. The girl took a breath. "Everything the king told you was a lie. Your homes were prisons, your feast poisons. The monsters he commanded you to kill were not monsters, But your own children. There were a few shocked gasps as people struggled with this horrifying idea. Peg pointed to where Lillian stood with protective arms around her son. That woman is one of you. Her real name is Lillian. The boy standing beside her is her child, her very own. Lillian drew her precious Timothy closer, and the two hugged as if they might crush the world between them. Somewhere in this room is your own child, Peg said, voice trembling. It's time you met each other. Many a historian will tell you that a great performance is just as much a matter of timing as it is material. After missing their supper and breakfast doses of devil's drum, the grown-ups were no longer affected by the king's drug. When the princess spoke the truth to them, they studied the dirty-faced slave standing before them, and, as if waking from slumber, staggered backward, overcome by the truth about their perfect lives. Spears clattered to the ground as the adults remembered how they had been made to forget the cursed birthday, how they had lived as prisoners for all these years, and now how they had very nearly just murdered their own children. At that very moment, Longclaw and his horde charged into the eating hall, weapons high. They had been expecting to join forces with the king's army, gobble whatever children remained, and then crush the ravens once and for all. But upon entering, they were greeted by a different sight altogether. The adults' weapons were strewn across the floor. Still more alarming, King Incarnadine was nowhere to be found. Longclaw scanned the scene with some confusion. Where is he? He snarled at the frightened people. Where's your ruler? Up here, a small voice called out. Longclaw looked to see two children, almost identical, standing at the top of the clock tower stairs. The one with the bandage across his eyes stepped forward. My sister and I have reclaimed what was rightfully ours. Your king is no more. You two? The ape was now grinning. For years he had fantasized about seizing the palace for his own, stopped short only by his fear of the king's deadly armor, but now it seemed his moment had arrived. Even with ravens perched against the walls, the apes enjoyed a distinct advantage. Well, your majesty, he said, stepping closer. Way I count it, you're outnumbered. Not quite. The girl stepped to her brother's side. Subjects, she called out, turning her brilliant gaze upon them once more. These are the jailers who kept your children as slaves. They tormented us for 10 long years, and now they threaten us once more. How will you answer them? As one, every man, woman, and child seized a weapon from the ground and turned to face the horde. The princess raised a spear above her head. Then let us put an end to this cursed battle at last. Chapter 31. The blessed reunion. The night patrol was polished off in a matter of minutes. Their cannons and catapults were trampled to bits by the massive wave of human soldiers, leaving the beasts defenseless against the ravens. Captain Simon and his troops finished off the apes with swift justice. Every toenail and tuft of hair was collected and dumped into the sea. With the battle finally over, the adults rushed to find their long-lost children. The reunion that followed was perhaps the happiest moment in the history of the world. Tears of joy ran so freely that the bloody streets were soon washed completely clean. Peter wandered among the restored family, searching for his own lost companion. The knight, however, was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until that afternoon that Peter's ears caught the familiar clop of miniature hooves. Sir Toad! He exclaimed, rushing to meet his friend. He would have swept him up in a huge hug were it not for his right arm being bound in a sling. I was beginning to think you were avoiding me. I was, in a manner, Sir Toad said sheepishly. I didn't want to see you until I made things right. He pushed something across the stones to Peter's feet. The boy reached down to find the haberdasher's mysterious box. He opened the lid. Inside sat 3 pairs of eyes. One gold, one black, and one bright emerald green. It's a miracle they weren't destroyed in the battle, Sir Toad said. By my 3rd pass around the palace, I'd begun to lose hope. I finally spotted them tucked in a gutter, safe as could be. Don't worry, I rinsed them off. Peter took the green eyes in his hand. Every atom within him confirmed that the moment had come. At last he would wear the eyes of Hazel Good. He imagined what sort of incredible powers they might convey, powers fit for a prince. He pulled the bandage from his head, slipped the eyes into his sockets, and blinked. All at once the boy was struck down by a bolt of brilliant light. He screamed as he fell to the ground. "Peter!" Sir Toad ran closer. "What's wrong?" The pain was unlike anything Peter had ever felt in his life. He didn't care what these fantastic eyes were supposed to do. He just wanted it to stop. The blaze sliced through his pupils and went straight into his brain. He could hear it, taste it, feel it, smell it. Thrusting a hand into his uncle's armor was nothing compared to the agony he was now experiencing. He had expected the fantastic eyes to change his body in some amazing way, make him stronger, able to fly. But all they did was hurt. His cries had attracted the attention of Simon, Peg, and a few others. They crowded around him, watching as the boy moaned in agony. The princess knelt beside him, terrified. "What's happening to you?" Peter tried to speak, but could only manage a whisper. "Stop it." He curled into a ball and clenched his eyelids tight. Only then did the torture slowly subside, dulling to a faint throb. After a moment, he took a deep breath and cracked his lids once more. The light came back, shocking him from ear to ankle. This time, however, he forced himself to endure it. His heart was racing out of control. His legs were weak. His skin was pale. And that's when it hit him. "My skin," he said, gasping. "It's pale. Good heavens, you're not turning invisible," Sir Toad said. "No." Peter brought his hand closer to his face. "I can see it." The light was still excruciating, but now he could discern the shape of a palm and 5 long fingers, his fingers. Slowly, things were becoming clearer. He could see stones on the ground. He could see the crowd around him. "They're just normal eyes." He blinked, welling up with tears. "My very own pair of eyes." Of course, there was nothing the least bit ordinary about these eyes, for they shone with a brilliance that would have shamed the sun. The people nearby saw his transformed face and bowed in reverence. Peter was more awed than any of them. He studied his elbows, his legs, the bottoms of his bare feet. Everything was beautiful and wondrous. He saw Sir Toad, understanding for the first time just how ridiculous the man-cat-horse creature was. He saw the sky, marveling at how it melted from blue to red to gold. "Is the sky always like that?" he said. "Oh, that dark part is my favorite color then. Oh, I have a favorite color." Peter had spent his entire life trapped in darkness, and now he was finally free. He rose to his feet somewhat unsteadily and looked straight into Peg's emerald eyes. "It's good to see you," he said. She smiled back and took his hand. "It's good to see you too." The people who witnessed this moment swore that, like Peter, the kingdom itself took a truer form. The 10 years of captivity and oppression seemed to vanish all at once, leaving only a powerful hope in the world to come. At long last, the royal birthday that had been cut short so many years ago was concluded. There was celebration and dancing throughout the whole palace. Peter and Peg were crowned the king and queen of Hazelport. Captain Simon and his ravens were reinstated as the royal guard, and each bird was given a pair of golden spurs to commemorate their valor. To good old Frederick and his friends, the young rulers offered safe harbor for as long as they should like it. The ancient turtles, who had searched many years for a quiet home, gratefully accepted. They floated in a circle around the shores, creating 6 island moons, which protected the kingdom for the rest of its days. Sir Toad was appointed to the position of royal storyteller. As you know, there is no nobler profession in the world, and the old knight enjoyed his post immensely. He regaled children and their parents with tales of daring do. Among his favorites was the story of how he and Captain Simon single-handedly freed the royal guard from the army of thieves. Peter's right hand, which had been damaged beyond repair in his fight against the king, had to be severed from his wrist. At his insistence, the surgeons and blacksmith replaced it with the barb of the giant's fish hook that had served him so well in battle. Peter Nimble's silver hand would prove a loyal companion for many adventures to come. So he hurt his hand so badly whenever he reached in and grabbed the pen off and stopped the clockwork. All those barbs and everything had cut his hand up too badly, so they had to cut it off. But he put his fish hook on there, like Long John Silver, so that now instead of a hand, he has a fish hook. That's pretty funny. After a few months, Hazelport received its first visitor from the outside world. King Peter and Queen Peg were practicing their alphabets in Mrs. Lillian's grammar class when they heard a voice cry, "Ahoy there!" from the harbor. The voice was a familiar one, and the moment Peter heard it, he jumped from his desk and sprinted across the palace as fast as his royal feet would carry him. "Mr. Pound!" he shouted, attacking the man in a great hug. "Hello, Your Majesty." Mr. Pound clapped the boy on the shoulder, looking him over. "Why, I think you've grown a foot since I last saw you." He led the boy toward the boat behind them. Its deck was piled high with stacks upon stacks of newly bound books. The professor thought Hazelport could do with a good library, and he brought something else. He ran aboard and returned a moment later with a pair of winged zebras in tow. He carefully led them down the narrow gangplank. One of the creatures nickered, gently pressing its nose into Peter's cupped hand. The boy recognized it as the beast he had saved in the alley so long ago. "Oh, hello again," he said softly. Queen Peg, who had since caught up with her brother, stared at the creatures in awe. Are those flying ponies?" she said. "You like them?" Mr. Pound patted their shining flanks. "The professor put the wings on only last week. They are a belated birthday present for the new rulers of Hazelport." "You mean we can keep them?" She gave a squeal of delight, throwing her arms around a zebra's striped neck. "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you." "They aren't the only new arrival. The professor has granted me leave so that I might stay a while here as a royal advisor." He gave a bow. "If it pleases your majesties." Peter's eyes glanced toward the empty horizon and then down to his feet. "Tell the professor it pleases us very much," he said softly. Mr. Pound, who was not without his own extraordinary gifts, took the boy's shoulders. "I hear your disappointment, lad. Professor Cake would have liked to come in person, but as you know, he's very busy with things back on the island." Peter nodded. Rescuing more strangers, no doubt," he said with a trace of a smile. The boy looked searchingly at the owly-browed, red-nosed man. He knew, didn't he? The message, the eyes, this kingdom. Professor Cake knew all along he was sending me home. Mr. Pound gave an evasive shrug. The old man is full of surprises." The next moment, he burst into a wide smile. "And speaking of surprises, who is this I see? Make way, step aside, royal storyteller coming through." Royal storyteller? Mr. Pound could not hide his amusement. An oppressive title. Sir Toad clopped through the gates to join them. "Yes, well, I've retired from all that knight-errant nonsense," he said, polishing a hoof. "It was beneath my dignity, really." Mr. Pound rubbed his chin, feigning disappointment. "It's a pity to hear that." He rifled through his pack and took out a black decanter with a waxen cork. "You see, the professor recently came across this bottled message from a rather distressed hag." Sir Toad's whiskers twitched with apprehension. Good heavens! There's not a curse in there, is it?" "Oh, far from it. It's a cry for help. It seems the poor girl's gotten herself stranded on an island infested with rats." He raised an eyebrow. "You ask me, I think she'd be pretty grateful to whoever rescued her." "Remember, a hag is who put the curse on Sir Toad, remember?" Sir Toad caught his breath, hardly daring to speak. "She might even undo a certain enchantment?" "Well, there's one way to learn." Mr. Pound offered the bottle to Sir Toad. "I could have a boat ready within the week." "A week? Why, that's so little time." Sir Toad looked back at his newfound home, at Simon Pegg and finally Peter. "Your Majesty," he said timidly, "I wondered whether, if you were willing, that is, perhaps you would join me." Peter squinted at the wide open waters stretching into forever. There was a song in the waves that he had known his whole life. He smiled. a short trip wouldn't hurt," he said. The knight loosed a chair, clapping about with joy. "Splendid! We must begin our preparations at once." He snatched the bottle in his teeth and galloped into the palace. "Open the larder! Fetch me a map!" His voice rang throughout the halls. "Come on, Peter! Adventure, ho!" The rescue of the stranded hag was but one of many legendary journeys Peter shared with Sir Toad. Though Hazelport would always be his true home, the boy knew he was not born to rule like his sister. He could never remain ashore too long without feeling the itch to sail out once more. Sir Toad always insisted on joining him, believing rightly that one should never leave a good friend to adventure alone. With the help of Mr. Pound, Queen Peg was able to rebuild the palace into what a palace should be. The walls and floors were gutted of their clockwork. The mines underground were cleared of their chains, and from that day forward, chores of any kind were strictly outlawed. I wonder how they kept it clean. Professor Cake never did manage a visit, but his floating library was a popular addition to the landscape. The people were able to learn all about important subjects like history and alchemy and poetics. Gradually, Hazelport drew itself onto the maps of the world, if only as a tiny speck. It was known among sailors as a small, hard-to-find place, filled with kind people and impossible wonders. It was by no means a paradise. There were squabbles and arguments. Crimes were occasionally committed and feelings sometimes hurt. But on the whole, the kingdom was a happy one, where all the children obeyed their parents and all the parents doted on their children. And so it went in Hazelport. As time passed, the children of the kingdom grew to have children of their own, and those children had more children, and so on. The story of Peter Nimble and his fantastic eyes was handed down to each generation, the tale of a prince who became a thief to become a king. The end. Good book. Good book. We will talk about it.